YouTube fans, it's Seth here again. So today we're going to talk about a BR600. So first of all, we're going to show you how to do an inspection on it in part one. Part two, we're going to show you how to get a little bit more power out of this thing and how to kind of revive the engine. And part three is going to be nothing, because that's really all you can do with one of these is inspect it and revive it. So anyways, there's plenty of good videos out there on how to service it. I've seen some really good information. Basically it's just changing filters and a spark plug. But we're going to go through a couple of things. We're going to go through a tool list, we're going to go through a parts list, and then we're going to go through the engine and some tricks. So first, let's get to the inspection. Okay, so on these Stihl blowers here, one of the things you're going to want to inspect is the clamp here. They have these both on the 500, the 600, the 550, and the 700. This one's still in good shape. It's actually holding the throttle cable. So that's the first thing I like to do when I inspect it. The next thing I like to do is make sure that my throttle is tight and it returns properly. This one does. This is actually a newer cable. I know that because I just recently replaced it. The next thing you're going to want to look at on one of these is another wear spot. We're just starting from the tube out, but this collar right here, if you can kind of see this one is definitely worn out and it's got a lot of play. That means that collar joint in there is worn down very thinly, so that needs to be changed out. After that, you go around, and I've already pre-removed the screws. Obviously this thing needs a cord for it. It's broke. So there's 3 screws, you remove them, it comes off, and then the cowling, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 underneath. You remove them and you look at that. You go in here, if this right here looks like it's broken or starting to break, you're going to want to change this out on this, the throttle cable. That's another thing. That's a common point where they break at. Something else that you'll see on these is these leaking. Like this one right here is leaking. Now what that's a sign of, when you see it around here, that's a sign that the bearings are going on it. And this one, you can actually feel it. It's got play. So that means the bearings on this one are going to need to be done. So when we're refreshing up, we're going to replace the bearings on it. Also, you've got these annular boofers. And these annular boofers, if you look, this one right here is completely worn through. Those need to be changed. Something else you're going to want to look at is your fuel tank. These are known to leak on the edge of the fuel tank here. And if the fuel O-ring looks good and it's not leaking, then you can leave that alone. You know, obviously you'll inspect the air filter, change it. Something common on these primer balls leak. I normally stock these in my stockpile of stuff that I store. So I normally have about 2 or 3 of these laying around because these will leak. And what this will do is this will actually push fuel through it and it'll piss all over your cowling here. And that's another common problem. Something else you're going to want to look at is in between the housing here. They have springs that go together which allow it to wiggle around. And you don't feel the vibration. Those are called anti-vibration springs, or AV springs as Stihl calls them. Those need to be looked at. Lastly, you'll want to check your tank mounts here. These actually will wear and they will bust through if these annular boofers aren't regularly inspected, like once a year or however often you use it. And us, we inspect them twice a season because in the state of Washington, you got leaf season. So these things get ran pretty much all year long. Another common point is you'll want to look at your muffler here. When the crank bearings start to go out, if the muffler cracks, that's a good sign that you want to check your crank and make sure it doesn't have any play. This one hasn't broke yet, but if we let it go a little bit longer, it would be going. And those are your wear points that you're going to want to inspect on your blower. Obviously, straps are, you know, kind of a common sense thing. A lot of my guys will sit there and they'll zip tie stuff. Obviously this one right here is a newer one, this one's an older one. It doesn't need to be changed yet, but it's probably going to be soon enough that it does get changed because it's on the wear side. So that's about it for your inspection. As far as looking at it once a week and just making sure, or once every 2 weeks, making sure everything's good to go. So we're going to get right to the next stuff. Okay, so when I do this, I like to do this right. So when I do this, I get my camshaft wheels. I normally stock one of these. I've got these look like exhaust valves. There's a part number for you. I've got my intake valves. And then these are not a Stihl part. Stihl does not like you rebuilding their crankshafts. They would rather sell you an entire crankshaft. These are done by a company called Sawzilla. This is the parts that you can use to replace their crankshaft bearings. Now there is a cam gear on, or there is a crankshaft gear on there because these are a 4-cycle engine, and obviously they use a geared cam wheel like the one right here. But I do everything at once. The other thing is we got our collar. We've got our recoil starter for that, and that's about all we're going to need outside of our filters and our other stuff. And again, there's plenty of good videos on filter and whatnot replacement, so it'll be part of it. We'll show you some tips and tricks. And lastly, this is the most important piece. This is a BR700 fan wheel. So as I said, I was going to throw some tips and tricks in here. When I do one of these, I like to make it as easy as possible. So when I go to disassemble one of these, I remove the 2 bottom bolts from the tank that are on the bottom right here. And I pull my carburetor off after I've got the 2 screws loose from the thing. And I remove it from there. I remove it from here. And all I have to do at this point, see if I can get a better view of it here. All I have to do at this point is remove the throttle cable and the whole thing comes off. It's as simple as that. So another tip on doing this is once you use this and loosen your spark plug, what you're going to do is you're going to install this piston stop right like so in the spark plug hole. And now what we're going to do, we're going to spin our flywheel until it's all the way to the loosening spot. And just like any other nut, it's lefty-loosey. It's a 13 millimeter. This comes up, bolt goes in the tray. And we install our flywheel knocker. Tighten it all the way down, loosen it a couple of turns, grab your flywheel, and there you go. As simple as that. The flywheel is now off, and as you can see, this is something else you want to inspect. The keyway here is very important because these will strip out and they'll cause all sorts of problems. So another trick on this is when you're removing your air tube here, what I like to do is I like to pull out this screw, I like to pull out this screw, and I like to pull out this one, and then there's this one right here. And then what I do with this is I grab a flathead screwdriver, pry it up a little bit, and I just walk the tube out. See if I can get a view of that, but just kind of walk the tube out real gently. And if you have to, it'll pry up, and then you can pry out on the edges, like so. And again, just walk the tube out, like that. Okay, so now we're going to give you another tip. So with our piston stop still installed, and you can use a piece of rope or They even make plastic piston stops that they sell online. But either way, this is actually a factory Stihl tool. But you can use anything as long as it binds up the thing from spinning. So if you pay attention here, I'm going to get out of frame here a little bit, but you can see where it says off at, and it's got arrows. You pay attention to those, because that's the way some of these spin left-handed, some of these spin right-handed. But what I normally do is I will chalk these in a vise, just like so. In there, paying attention to the way it goes, I'm going to remove that bad boy. And you need to have it tight. It may put a dent in it. It's not going to hurt it, the functionality of it. But these are on there tight. And there's a reason why it's actually wanting to move the vise. But there we go. Now we got the fan wheel off. Sometimes they spin easy, sometimes they don't spin easy at all. But either way, it comes off, and there you have it. And that is how you remove the fan wheel on one of these. So when we're doing the initial inspection, this will be mounted in the unit as you're seeing it faced. And what you're going to want to look for is at these points right here. A lot of times you'll see leakage around the valve cover gasket, heavily like what's on the bottom here. And that's a good indication that these mounting points are broke. So if you could take the engine, you could wiggle it back and forth in the frame. This engine in this block is trashed. You'll need a new one. Another common place they break is right here, where it mounts to the recoil that bolt goes through. They'll break off this one down below, and they'll break off these two as well when they're mounted in there. So again, if you could pull that engine back and forth and you can wiggle it, you're done. It's shot at that point. There's no sense in attempting to rebuild it. You need a new engine or you need a new blower. So now comes the fun part. First things first, we're going to want to take out our piston stop. So we're going to remove that. We're going to wipe our bench off. So now that we got this thing most of the way clean, it's not perfect. I don't have a parts washer where I can just shove it in at, but if you look, these ones have got the actual Stihl seals in there. They're discolored, but they're actually blue. And you can see this, you can barely see it, but you can feel it moving up and down in there. In fact, we'll put a runout gauge on it just to show you. Okay, so we got this set up on the dial runout gauge, so we're going to zero it out. And if you look at this, when you zero it out, we got about 6 to 8 thousandths worth of play in this bearing. And that's a lot. You don't want that. That will vibrate. Okay, so when tearing one of these apart, I normally leave the exhaust manifold on. I start with the cam side. So what I'll do is I'll pull this off. And I'll put my bolts in my bolt tray. And then Stihl's real nice. They actually give you an area on this. Or you can take a flathead screwdriver right here. You can kind of raise it and break the seal loose. They've got the same thing on this side as well. So when that seal's broken loose, you can just kind of easily lift this thing off. And what you'll see is there's 2 pins, and up close here you've actually got arrows on this. These arrows correspond to the marks in here, which when you line this thing up, you turn the crank over. It's going to be a little bit tougher because I don't have the thing on there, but these marks line up. Right like so. And they're straight across and they're perpendicular. Normally there's an arrow in here, but I don't see the arrow in here on this one for whatever reason. They decided not to do it. But anyways, that lines up like that. And that means it's at TDC. And where I like to be at afterwards, after getting that lined up, is what I'll do is I'll remove my valve cover, which I've already loosened. And I will undo the valves just a hair bit, because when you stick new valves in these, they're always going to require readjustment. So I'll undo them enough to where I can slide it over. I'll pull out the first push rod, lay it right there in my deal. I'll undo my second one. And then I'll pull out the push rod again. And then I've got my camshaft. And on this cam wheel, this one actually looks okay, except you can see that this has got play in it and this wear on this mark here. So what I will do is when this starts to wear out and it gets play like that, if you look, this upper one right here, the tab is actually broken on it, so you're going to want to change this out, because what's going to happen is this thing is going to fly apart, and you don't want it flying apart. You want these to stay intact. So when they get play in them like that, they're not supposed to have any. I will replace that. And this is your cam wheel shaft. Goes in there, and then you've got your rocker pin shaft. And this is a small engine. It doesn't really matter how they go back together, just as long as they do go back together. So now we can pull the engine cover off. And again, it looks like this one may or may not have sealed. And it probably got sealed because it had a bad camshaft. Or it just had bad crank bearings in it. But either way, it doesn't really matter. These blue seals indicate that these are factory Stihl seals. The new ones we're going to put in are black. And when we pull this out, this is obviously stuck in here really good. There we go. Now we got some movement on it. But anyways, you just pull that straight out, and you can see that this piston, it's actually, the rings in it are in excellent shape, and it's only got a slight scar on both sides. So this piston we can safely reuse. I mean, it's just, you can barely see the scratch marks in the side of the cylinder here, but it's good to go. But you look at these valves and they're pretty recessed in the head. So what we're going to do is we're going to set our piston aside and we're going to pop our valves out. So there's one, and these are the exact same thing. You don't have to worry about mixing and matching them. And then there's two. Obviously that one just fell out. This one's not coming out as easy. But this one's the intake valve right here. And you can see that it's still in okay shape, but the face of it's starting to give way. The exhaust valve is normally where you get into trouble at on these. And as you can see, this exhaust valve is super pitted for what they normally would look like from new, and you can also see the ridge on it here. So when we do this, I'm sure you can find a good lapping video, but the seats on this look okay when you're inspecting it, and again, the cylinder wall on this one looks okay. And the piston's barely got any wear on it. I know it's got a little bit of scoring here, but if it comes down to replacing the scored piston, which this thing is just, it's not even scored, those are just marks. It's better to just buy an engine for it at that point. You're not going to fix that. But what I do is I separate my rings out. You want the rings on the skirt sides. You want them 180 degrees apart, that way it gets the best compression. And you can check and see what you have for a ring gap inside there. I don't normally bother with it because it's just not something I'm concerned with. Normally when I put one of these back together, they're almost always leaking out there. And you can also check too that this doesn't have any play in it, which it doesn't. You can't physically feel it, you're good to go. Now what I do when I do these is you could do it one of two ways. So what you've got is you've got the gear itself, and you can see just barely here that this gear on this one, this tooth right here lines up with this one right here. So what we do to get that right is we remember that, and what I'll do is I'll take a Sharpie and I will get my caliper out, and on the new bearings, wherever I put them at, the way that I line those up is these are clean, so I'm going to take off my dirty gloves here. But when I do these bearings, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rub this down with a little bit of brake cleaner, which was already on that rag. But anyways, I rubbed it down with a little bit of brake cleaner. I'm going to take my mic, or my caliper, which is going to be my straight edge. And then I'm just going to mark it like so. And that is how I'm going to line that bearing back up. Okay, so we're back here. We've got our clamshell puller. This is a snap-on tool. And what we're going to do here to get the bearings off is we're going to install our clamshell puller on the bearing itself. We're going to snatch that around there like that and put that one around there like that. And this one's obviously too small, so we got to go for the larger clamshell puller. So we're just going to set this aside. So here we go. Let's get the larger one here. So let's spread this all the way open and throw it on there like so. Just like so. You're not going to hurt the piston. Just leave it kind of there. And these always say wear safety glasses. I'm a big advocate for safety, however. I don't know where my safety glasses actually went, so I'm not wearing them, but I would suggest wearing safety glasses. I'm about to grab my grinder helmet in a minute before I start to pull on this thing, because these things sometimes, you know anything about bearings, they will come out and they will fly apart. So let's get this set up just right. We want to have the screw all the way out so we can center it like so, and then you'll want to undo it just a hair bit, because you're going to want to have this again centered. So we had our crescent wrench right here. You know, my tool bench is kind of a mess, but let's tighten this down all the way where we need it at, because we don't want to have a mistake made. It'd probably be faster if I just used a gear wrench. Truth be known, it really would be. It'd be faster if I used a gear wrench, but I'm doing this. Lots of money was worth of tools. So there, it already popped actually. And there's our first one. So there's our first one, which just rolled off onto the ground. Now we're going to go for our second one. And what we're probably going to have to do is we're probably going to have to get a longer set of bolts because this arbor on this side is longer. So we're going to start back with that on there. Okay, so now that we've got the clamp installed with some longer bolts on it, what I do is I will actually run these. If you look, I will actually grab the bearing and the gear at the same time. The reason being is they both slide off evenly. So now we're going to grab that and we're going to undo it, just like we did on the former one. So when putting these back on, I already got it on there, but when putting the bearings back on for your flywheel side, what I do is I like to grab a spacer the same size, and I will actually use the nut. You got to be careful when you do this. This spacer is actually made out of bronze, but I will just start to slowly turn it on, and if I start to feel anything grab, I back the nut right back off, just immediately. But you can see that it is starting to push the bearing on, and it's not all the way on there. You can kind of see that it's not. So we have to grab another spacer or another set of washers. So what I'll do is I'll grab another set of washers, and you just kind of keep building them up until it goes on. So here we go. I got some more washers on there. I got a washer that's the same size as the arbor down below. You can see it kind of moving around there. But anyways, we just want to push that all the way on there. And again, now we're down to our stopping point. So we need to find another washer. The right amount of pressure to it, and it will turn. And then it will line up as it goes down. So let's just get that on there the rest of the way. And you can see that it's down there. And it is now all the way on. You can see that in the picture. Now, for our other bearing, we're actually going to use the old fan wheel as a tool. And the same thing applies. So we're going to put our bearing on there that we marked with the Sharpie, if I can find it here. I don't remember what I did with it. But either way, I can always mark another one with a Sharpie. And that down like so. And I just heard it pop. So that's good. And now our bearing is 100% seated on the journal of the crankshaft, which is right where we want it. Now, you remember we had a gear, okay? So what we're going to do is we're either going to take our Sharpie mark, we're going to line it up there, or we're going to line it up back over here. Just like so, against the Stihl mark on there, which I'm not sure if you can see because I'm not in front of the camera. But yeah, so the Stihl mark right here is what we want our Sharpie mark to line up with. I can get a good view of that. I don't know if I can or I can't. Yeah. But anyway, so our Sharpie mark is going to line up right there in the dead center of it. So when we put our cam gear on, remember, it has a lip. As you're looking at, the lip on this thing goes to the inside. So when we're doing this, we want the notch on the cam gear, and if we want to make good reference to it, you can use any of the notches. It doesn't really matter. But you're going to want to line your Sharpie up, and you're going to want to get it pretty much just straight on, like so. And you can actually verify that by looking at it and looking at the pin and seeing that your actual gear is straight up and down with the pin. Now these always have generally a little bit of movement on them. And what we're going to do is we're going to, again, we're actually going to use a bearing on it this time. So we've got a thrust bearing. So when we line our Sharpie mark up, where we got it lined up right, like so, we got it lined up, and we're going to line the gear up almost right on, and then we're going to eyeball it. And we're not quite there, because we're not quite there yet. So now that we're right on, if we Sharpie it, and we Sharpie it, you want that to line up just like so. So now we are lined up, and you can see that if you're looking at that right on, that does line up with that tooth. So that's how you want it to line up. This with one of these. It doesn't really matter which one. And then you want your two teeth, you want the thing in between, the whatever they call that, the space in between, or the mesh between the gears to go straight up and down with the connecting rod. And you can see that it's lined up with that hole almost perfectly. When you're looking at it straight on, it's lined up with that hole almost perfectly. In fact, it is perfect on this one. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab our thrust bearing out. And this is our thrust bearing. We can't quite fit the thrust bearing on there yet. So we need to push the gear down on there a little bit more. So now if you look at it, you can actually push the gear down a little bit more. And again, we're going to reline the gear. We're going to line up one of them teeth with that Stihl mark. And then we're going to line up our Sharpie mark, just like so, with the Stihl mark. And we're going to go right on. And we're going to make sure that our gear, the space in between the gears, is lined up straight up and down with the connecting rod journal. So when we do that, we want it to be just at the end, pointing at the very tip of that, and that is perfect. So now we're going to put our thrust bearing on there because we don't want this gear moving at all. We don't want that gear moving at all. We want to keep that as still as possible. And then we're going to add a washer. And we're going to use our tool again. And we can actually add a couple of washers this time around. I do believe I lost them on the floor when I moved the cart. But again, and if you want, you can fast forward some of this. I know I'm talking a lot. That's kind of annoying to some people who watch YouTube just to get a clue. But anyways, we're going to put our fan tool back on. And we're going to squish that down, making sure that, again, the gear, and we'll check it one last time, now that we've got our tool on there, we'll make sure our Sharpie, and there it is. That is dead on. And it doesn't have to be perfect, because these things actually have a little bit of play in the cam wheels themselves. So it's not going to mess up your perfect world if it isn't on there just perfectly, but it will make a difference in its ability to make your sanity better, because you know if you've got it on there good to go. And again, you're using a thrust bearing, so this thing actually turns on the inside with absolutely no effort whatsoever. As you're doing it, the thrust bearing actually turns on its race. And now that's all the way to the point where it can't be pushed anymore. So we got to undo it again. And we got to put it back on there again. And now we're going to reseat it. And we're going to grab our vice grips, because this one's a little bit tight, or our channel locks, and we're going to continue to work it on there. If I can get a hold of it. I don't remember which way I went the last time, but I do believe that, here we go. This is the way I went. So we're getting it on there. And again, we're using the fan wheel to kind of hold it, because that's what we want. We want the fan wheel to hold this as we sit there and we put it back together. And we're grabbing, and if we need to, we can chock it in the vise too. I'm never against using the vise, but we want our fan wheel to get as much of that as possible. Obviously, this isn't going to work as well as I thought it would. There may be a little bit of discrepancy in the size of this actual washer as far as pushing it on goes. So we're going to restack some washers up here and possibly even use, oh, no, we're not good enough yet. So we're going to restack our washers on there, because we don't want to damage, again, that shaft. We're just going to use those. We're going to get this baby down as much as we can, squishing it in place. There we go. Now we got it moving nicely. And there we go. There's that. Now we're going to stuff this one on there again. And first, I think we'll stuff this other one on there, because we know that one definitely fits better than the one that was actually sized almost exactly. So now we're going to go again. We're going to squish the gear on there the rest of the way. And now the gear is fully seated. And that, my friends, is the big secret on seating the gear. And now you've got a perfectly aligned gear where it was, because you used your Sharpie. You used your Sharpie mark to line it back up. And that is lined perfectly. Or as perfect as you can get it. And now comes the reassembly part. Okay, so we've got our stack of, or we got one spacer on there. We're going to stick one more on there, and they're the same size as the arbored shaft. So now what we're going to do is we're going to keep twisting this down like so. And they're going to line up just like so. And it's going to keep pushing the bearing down. Just like so, just like it did. Now we're going to have to stack a couple more on there. And that bearing is going down very nicely. This is actually, if you could twist it by hand, you're not putting much stress on that actual shaft. But you just got to keep working it down and squishing it. So now what we can actually do is, if we can find one that'll fit, another spacer that's small enough, what we can do, which I don't think I have any, but I got plenty of washers. So we're just going to throw some more washers at it and keep squishing it down on the journal. Let's find some of those. So I got my valve lapping compound here, and there's two sides to this one. This is an old school Cloy's one. You got fine and you've got coarse. I always use fine when I start one of these. The reason being is because there's no need to run coarse. These are small, they don't get very bad. So I'll get a little bit of my goo there. Again, these are brand new valves. And I will basically shove it on the end of the stick here. If I can, I will. If not, what I will do is I will just work that as I try to drop everything down in there. I will work it down in there with my fingers. And there we go. See if I can see it. So I'll get the valve on the thing. And now that I got it down in there, I can use my fancy dancy valve lapping tool. With a little bit of pressure on the other side, I can kind of lap it in a little bit. And it doesn't take much to lap them in. It really doesn't. These things don't really carbon, or they carbon more up than anything. And this one feels good to go. And that is how you lap one of these valves into place. So you don't need to watch me lap both of them into place. We're going to put this together. You see now I pulled the springs off. It's the exact opposite. And we're going to come back to this with the springs on and line up the camshaft. So as we continue on here, we're lubing up our valves. I use green grease to install them. And we'll put these valves in here. Get those in there straight. They're kind of a pain in the ass, but you got an intake, which is slightly larger. You got the exhaust. And you just kind of have to do the best you can to use your fingers if you got fat fingers like mine. Just line up the guide and push them in like so. Once they go in, which this one's in, you should just barely have enough finger to hold it in there like I'm doing. And you should have enough room to leverage over the rocker arm. You're going to want to leverage over the rocker arm. All the way over, and then we'll grab our valve spring. This side is intake. And we'll slide that valve spring on. That retainer's on. Then we'll go to our exhaust. And we'll slide our exhaust on. And we cleaned all the grime out of there too, that the valve grinding stuff or valve lapping stuff leaves. So now you got these bad boys. I don't know if you can see it or not, but they're in there, and they're in there tight, and they're in there good, and they look just perfect. So what we're going to do now is we're going to grab some 30-weight braking oil from the shelf over here that we use for the lawnmowers. And we're just going to lube up our cylinder walls nicely. We're going to make sure that we got our rings spread apart. So one on one side of the piston skirt and the other one on the other side of the piston skirt, and they're about 180 out. And we're going to grab our 30 weight again. We're going to lube the piston. We've already got the cylinder. We've got everything good. It looks clean. So we're going to put our piston back in there with our crankshaft facing the correct orientation. We're going to clean the silicone off of this real fast. That's just one. That's two. There's no more. Everything looks good to me. Yep, everything looks good. Then we got some fingerprints on there, but anyways, we're going to shove our piston back in there. Like so. Work it in. Correct orientation. Journal at the bottom, or sorry, weight, balance weight at the bottom. Buddy at the top. New cam wheel, ready to go, facing up. New cam wheel good to go, facing up with those marks horizontal, your arrows horizontal on the cam wheel. Throw your pin in. We can now throw our other pin in. And if there's a little bit of silicone in there or paint marks, they have paint marks from the factory. But anyways, pay attention to these. You'll want the one that goes down. You'll want this edge. You want this edge, as you can see. You don't want that hitting the wall. You want one facing up. So you put your exhaust side in first in orientation, and then you put your intake side in orientation. So again, exhaust rocker first, second one is your intake. And now that you've got that all lined up, which is good to go, now we can install the face of it. Okay, so now that we got our parts clean, we're going to throw the cap or the bottom of the crankcase back on there. So the first thing you do is you grab your Durco and you're going to want to apply it to the crankcase itself, which is the bottom piece. You're going to want to put a thin layer around it. Just a thin layer. It doesn't have to be super thick. And you want to make sure that your gloves are clean and everything else is clean, because this stuff won't stick otherwise and it'll leak on you. I like to make sure I get my edges where it goes together really well. I don't care if it's a little bit extra or it does stuff. But anyways, now that I got that good to go, in all the right areas, I know that I can now stuff my seals in. So what we're going to do is we're going to set this aside. We're going to be very careful with this because we've got that camshaft in alignment. We got the top of it clean. We're going to put seal number 1 in. And actually, that's the wrong seal. We need the new seals. So we're going to throw a little bit of grease on seal number 1. So we got seal number 1, which goes on the upper side. And we make sure not to, we got to be careful with this. So that's lined up. And then we're going to go to seal number 2. We still got a little bit of grease on our fingers from that other one. And seal number 2 is the flywheel side. We're going to make sure we get that very carefully. And because these are press fit, you don't have to grease the inside of the grease rings. Good thing my floor is clean. But anyways, you don't have to grease the inside where the springs are and worrying about them falling out. And you want to orient the springs towards the bearings. That's how these seals work. Don't put them in backwards, otherwise it will not seal and you will play hell trying to figure out why. And now that we got that done, and everything's in there tight, we can put back on the crankcase, like so. I hope I'm in frame here. We can put back on the crankcase like so. It squeezes out a little bit, and while we've got that like that, we're going to just lay that there against our brake cleaner bottle. We're going to throw a little bit of blue Loctite on them. On each one of them here. The whole thing just came off with it, so I don't know what that's about. There we go. think we just figured it out. So, blue Loctite on all of them. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we're going to throw them in there, like so. If I can find my T27 now. There it is. So we're going to go 1. We're going to go 2. And we're not going to tighten these down all the way. We're just going to tighten them down enough to keep the crankshaft still, because ultimately, A, we don't want it moving, and B, these get torqued down to spec. And I do believe the spec on these is documented online somewhere. I don't know it off the top of my head, otherwise I would give it right now. But we're just going to run these down somewhat tight. We're going to look up the spec, we're going to torque it, but the main point of this is to show you how to assemble it. So that's what we're primarily worried about, is assembling it right at the moment. So we're just going to worry about assembling it. So we've got those torqued in, we've got our camshaft all lined up. Now what we can do is we can clean our thing, which I meant to do a second ago. I actually did mean to clean this. So we need to clean this up real well. I have lost my steel wool. Oh, there's some right there. So we're going to clean this up real well and get this good and shiny. Yep, we're going to get this all good and shiny. This may require some brake cleaner again too, so we're going to get brake cleaner on there. Get that nice and damp with brake cleaner. There we go, that does work a little bit better. This piece of steel wool is kind of dirty. I don't know that I have another one accessible right at the moment. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take a brass wire brush on this, because this has got a groove in here that goes along there. We're going to take a brass wire brush. Like this kind of beat up one. With this brass wire brush, we're just going to kind of run it along in there. And the reason we're using brass, because aluminum is a soft metal. If you use steel, you'll scratch this. And we're just going to clean that groove out like so. Which that looks real nice. That looks real pretty. Yep, that's looking real good. We're next to this air diverter. And what that's for is that actually diverts the fuel in the engine, because this thing uses the fuel to lubricate it. And there's my other piece of steel wool. And now that we got this all clean, we're going to throw our cap back on our Durco, because we don't want that going dry and warming up. We're going to throw our cap back on our blue Loctite. And the blue Loctite, you're going to put blue Loctite on your crankshaft end bolts, or your the crankcase cap bolts, and you're going to put it on your mounting bolts, which go through these points to the blower housing. Those are the ones that always seem to have issues after you take them apart, but other than that, you don't really have to worry about much. After you put bearings in it, and everything is good to go like that, you will never have a problem with those crankshafts again. You can run this thing probably for another 600 to 800 hours, I would say. And by that point, it's time to buy a new one. But you'll have fun with this in the meantime. And 600 to 800 hours is a lot of time for a blower. Our guys run them pretty much, I would say our guys run them on a 40-hour work week, they run them about 8-9 hours a week. So if you figure that out, you've got about 3 years out of one of these before you have to buy another blower if you're using it professionally every day. There will be other things that need to be done. You may end up throwing it away, but this is just kind of a cool way, like I said, to get some more power out of it, and that didn't come out as nice as I thought it did initially. So we're just going to touch this up real fast here. There we go. There we go. And now we can hit it again. And what we're going to do first, before we shove that on there, now that we got that all clean and this surface all clean, is we're going to shove in our push rods. So we're going to go one on the one side, after we get the rocker out of the way, respectively. And after we get that on there, because these are much easier to deal with when they're off the valves. And now that we've got that rocker on there, what we're going to do is we're just going to tighten this on there so that doesn't move. That way the rocker doesn't slip off and your valve doesn't slip out. And then same thing with the other side. We're going to slide our rocker out of the way, and we're going to move the valve push rod, or the push rod, in place and work it to where it needs to go over the valve. And you should be able to shove that thing in there on its pedestal. There we go. And again, we're going to tighten this down because we don't want that falling out. Just like so. And when you got them both lined up, these will be good to go. And there's a little bit of orange on that because I just touched the area where the silicone squirted out on me. Not a big deal. Just don't touch your mating surface from there and you'll be golden. But now, these won't slide off. They're actually a little bit tight, so we don't want them super tight. There we go. That's good enough. Just to where they wiggle a little bit, you'll see that. And now, you can apply your Durco to this guy because this is what you want to do. You want to mate it on this stuff. And again, being careful not to touch it because you don't want to interfere with the sealing ability of it. You just get it around there like so. And when you've got it all nice and red, you can put this thing to bed, just like so. It's not a thick layer, it's just a layer. And you set it over the top. Just like that. And now we get our bolts. We now have it assembled. You want these to ride up and down. You don't want to cross thread them as you're putting them in. This one right here isn't as important to torque. Those fins that you've seen on the inside there, you want to make sure those aren't broke. Those actually do deflect the fuel for lubricant over this piece. What they do is they're a heat sink and they get wet slightly. And what that wetness does is as that cam wheel spins and as the crankshaft spins, it actually pushes the fuel vapors that turn into droplets over the rest of the engine there, and they fan the camshaft and they fan the other parts. So now you've got that done. You always want to wipe this area off because you do not want that wheel where your magneto goes on there. But you don't want that having any reason to break loose or move or any other thing. And we're going to put this back on. And now that we got this back on, we're going to put our piston stop in there because we don't want to use the actual crankshaft. We don't want to use the flywheel as a stop. What we want to do is we want to use the piston stop as a stop or the rope, because again, this thing is keyed, and you want to tighten this down enough to where it now works. And then once we get everything back together, we're going to torque it. But now what you need to do is, you've seen that this thing rotated. What we need to do is watch our valves. And there we go. So we got one valve moving up and down. We got another valve moving up and down. And now what we're going to do is this edge of this magneto, it lines up with this one right here, this edge of the coil. And what we can do now is we can safely adjust those valves with our feeler gauge. I can find our feeler gauge amongst my mess here that I've made. I know I had it. I'm pretty sure it slid off. In fact, I'm almost positive it slid off. But that's okay, because when you used to buy these from Stihl, they actually used to give you feeler gauges for this job specifically. I'm just going to grab another one. So we stick our feeler gauge in here. Now that we got our piston stop out and we're set to the right point, we tighten it down, checking it constantly. You don't want to mistake it, the wrench being in there, but that one's good. And this one's good. And you can check your cork here. If this looks good, you can just reuse the valve cover gasket on these, and it's much easier at this point to throw this on there. And you have your bolt with the washer. This one's got a copper washer. I don't know if you can see that or not. Yeah. See, this has got a copper washer on here. And that's the one that goes in. And there you have it. As we're tightening this up, the most important part is how you install the bearings. And now you're ready to throw your blue Loctite on your mounting bolts and mount this thing back in your blower frame. and install your BR700 wheel on there. And that's how you do your crank bearings properly. We'll see you all later. Hope you enjoyed the video. One last thing, make sure to get your torque specs and torque your cap bolts down and torque your cover bolts down for the camshaft. And that's about it. That's all you really need to know about how to change those bearings.